we gather again, practitioners, to continue our journey through high magic practices. In this episode, we begin our study of the Clavicula Salomonis, the Key of Solomon the King, the single most influential grimoire in the Western ceremonial tradition, and the foundational architecture upon which centuries of ritual magic have been built. This text claims an authority older than history itself, a wisdom given by God to Solomon, sealed in the royal sepulchre, and hidden from the unworthy for generations. What we will examine today is not that legend, but the far richer truth behind it, the medieval manuscript tradition from which the clavicula actually emerged. The scholars who have worked to recover its oldest layers, and the book is sealed in the royal sepulchre after Solomon's death, where it waits until a group of Babylonian philosophers breaks open the tomb and discovers the knowledge within. A priest named Iohegrevis, possibly a legendary or symbolic figure, is then granted the divine understanding to read it, and through him the wisdom enters the world. This is the story the text tells about itself. It is, as scholars of the grimoire tradition have long established, entirely pseudepigraphical. The Key of Solomon was not written by Solomon. It was not transmitted across 3,000 years of unbroken lineage, and yet understanding exactly when, where, and how it was actually composed is what allows us to read it intelligently, and to work with it on terms more solid than romantic fiction. The scholarly consensus places the text's composition in 14th or 15th century Italy, drawing on Jewish Kabbalistic theology, Arab magical traditions, and Greco-Roman ceremonial magic transmitted through Byzantium. The earliest literary reference to a Key of Solomon appears in Peter of Abano's Loquidat Dubitabilium Astronomiae, a work composed between 1303 and 1310. A possible table of contents for the text was catalogued as early as 1260 by the scholar Jean-Patrice Boudet. The oldest known manuscript fragment, just 2 leaves from Book 2, was discovered by Matteo Cova in the Biblioteca Capitolare di Trento, and dates to somewhere between 1380 and 1410. The oldest complete manuscript is an Italian copy dated 1446, now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, itself probably translated from a Latin exemplar in the library of Duke Filippo Maria of Pavia around 1426. The text's most important ancestor is the Hydromandia, also called the Magical Treatise of Solomon, a collection of late Byzantine Greek grimoires surviving in 15th century manuscripts. The Greek Harley manuscript, 5596, in the British Library contains 24 pentacles and instructions for planetary talismans, magical swords, and angelic conjurations, much of which appears recognizably in the clavicula. Robert Mathieson of Brown University believed the Greek version was the original. The prevailing view among contemporary scholars holds that Byzantine Greek texts entered Italy after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and were translated into Latin and Italian, generating the manuscripts tradition we know today. What this means practically is that the Key of Solomon is not a document with a single origin point. It is the product of a centuries-long process of translation, synthesis, and transmission across several distinct scholarly and magical cultures. The scale of that transmission is documented most precisely in Robert Mathieson's foundational 2007 article, which catalogued 122 manuscripts in Latin alphabet languages and identified 11 distinct text groups. That number is not a curiosity. It is the central fact around which all serious study of the clavicula must be organized. Mathieson characterized the tradition as wild or open, not closed, meaning no single archetype can be reconstructed. There is no original from which all surviving copies descend. There are instead multiple overlapping families, each with its own variations in structure, chapter order, pentacle count, and ritual instruction. The Italian manuscripts include that oldest complete copy, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. A Florentine copy from 1494 held at the Biblioteca Medicia Larenziana, and the Sloane manuscripts from 1307 to 1309 in the British Library. 17th century copies that contain only 13 pentacles. The Latin manuscripts include the Trento fragment, the Coxti-25, which is the oldest complete Latin copy from the late 15th century, the additional 1086-2 in the British Library, a 17th century manuscript that Mathers used as his sole Latin source, and the Aubrey 24 in the Bodleian, copied in 1674 from an Italian original and organized into 4 books rather than 2. The French manuscripts are mostly 18th century and predominantly of the Colorno text group, named after Abraham Colorno, a Jewish engineer of Mantua who reportedly translated a Hebrew Sefer Maftea Shalaman into Italian around 1580. Key copies include Kings 288, Harley 3981, and Sloane 3091. The English tradition includes the additional 36674, known as the Key of Knowledge from the mid-16th century, and the Sloane 3847, dated 1572, and titled The Clavicle of Solomon, revealed by Ptolemy the Greek. The Hebrew manuscripts, held in the British Library as Oriental manuscripts 63360 and 14759, and in the Gollange manuscript copied in Amsterdam, are generally considered not to represent the original language of composition. They contain only 9 pentacles and conspicuously lack the magical wand, an implement present throughout the Latin and French traditions. Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers published The Key of Solomon the King through George Redway in 1889, and it remains the most widely circulated edition today. Mathers drew primarily from 18th century French Colorno manuscripts, supplemented by the Latin additional 1080-62 and the completely unrelated Lansdowne 1203, a text sometimes called the Rabbi Abognazar manuscript, which Joseph Peterson notes really should stand alone as a separate work. Mathers also made a deliberate editorial decision to omit 4 chapters dealing with love magic and operations of hatred, calling them Goetic interpolations. His reasons were partly moral and partly aesthetic. The result is that the standard Mathers edition presents a version of the text that is, by the standards of the manuscript tradition, both incomplete and selectively constructed. Peterson notes that while Mathers' editorial choices were not as severe as Arthur Edward Waite claimed, his edition still has significant shortcomings. It lacks a proper critical apparatus, underutilizes Latin and Italian sources, and contains notable mistranslations. One instructive example is Mathers' rendering of the Italian phrase artavo o falcetto. In the original, this term refers to a quill knife, a small, slightly curved blade used for shaping writing quills. Mathers, however, translated it as scimitar and sickle, effectively splitting a single tool into 2 distinct, large implements. Readers relying on Mathers' version for the Solomonic Ritual Toolkit would therefore learn an incorrect set of instruments, illustrating how even small translation errors can materially distort a text. Peterson addresses these deficiencies by drawing on dozens of manuscripts Mathers never consulted, documenting varied readings in extensive footnotes, and restoring the 4 chapters Mathers omitted. Stephen Skinner and David Rankin's The Veritable Key of Solomon, published in 2008, translated a beautifully illustrated 1796 French manuscript family with over 160 figures, and offered a comprehensive survey of the manuscript tradition alongside it. Jake Stratton Kent, through his Encyclopedia Goetica series, reframed the key not as a fixed canonical text, but as the titular archetype of a genre, a title shared by many books across centuries of parallel development. Understanding the Key of Solomon also requires situating it within the broader Solomonic corpus. The Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, often called the Lesser Key of Solomon, is a separate 17th century compilation composed of 5 books: the Ars Gotia, the Ars Theurgia Gotia, the Ars Paulina, the Ars Alma Dale, and the Ars Notoria. It focuses on the 72 demonic spirits Solomon supposedly bound in a bronze vessel. Despite the shared name, the Greater Key never mentions these 72 spirits. The relationship between the two texts is one of parallel tradition rather than direct descent. The Testament of Solomon, a far older document from somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, describes Solomon's ring-based demon binding and stands as the oldest Solomonic magical text. The ring itself is conspicuously absent from the clavicula's ritual instructions. The Heptameron of Peter of Abano shares operational material with the key and is frequently studied alongside it, particularly for its planetary angel system and circle construction. Some Italian manuscripts integrate material from both texts, further illustrating that the boundaries between these works were, for historical practitioners, more fluid than modern editions suggest. What emerges from this survey is a picture of the Clavicula Salomonis, not as a single authoritative grimoire with a recoverable original, but as a living tradition, a genre as much as a text, shaped by centuries of transmission, translation, and deliberate revision. This is not a diminishment, it is a clarification. Understanding that the Key of Solomon is a manuscript tradition rather than a fixed work is what allows serious practitioners to read any edition of it with the critical awareness that tradition-based practice requires. The Mathers edition remains historically significant and practically useful. But it is one branch of a much larger tree, and treating it as the definitive version is like studying a single manuscript of the Psalms and concluding one has read the entire biblical tradition. In this episode, we have traced the Clavicula Salomonis as a historical object. From its Byzantine Greek ancestors through the 14th century Italian manuscript fragments that represent its oldest surviving traces, through the great family of 122 copies catalogued by Matheson, to the 1889 Mathers edition that brought this work to the modern world, and on to the critical scholarship of Peterson, Skinner, Rankin, and Stratton Kent that has since recovered the tradition's full breadth. In our next episode, we descend into the interior of the text itself, with a chapter-by-chapter map of both books. From the theological foundation of Chapter 1 through the planetary hour system, the three-tier conjuration architecture, the catalogue of specific operations, and the complete sequence of 44 holy pentacles that closes Book 1. That structural knowledge is the grammar of the entire system. Without it, no individual operation within the clavicula can be properly understood or safely executed. That is it for today. Don't miss our next episode of High Magic Practices, where we will be mapping the complete architecture of the Key of Solomon, exploring how two books that seem backwards actually form one unified system for contacting and commanding spirits. If you've enjoyed this research, we invite the community to like and subscribe. It is your support that makes sustained, rigorous work of this kind possible. Our deepest gratitude to our Patreon supporters whose commitment allows this channel to approach the grimoire tradition with the care and scholarship it demands, rather than the sensationalism it so often receives elsewhere. May the holy names that stand guard at the threshold of this work attend our study and keep it faithful to the tradition we serve.